So without further ado, we'd like to start the panel, and what I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists to briefly, Laurie. Actually, each of the panelists briefly to introduce themselves, say who you are and how you got here and what you're doing, but very briefly. And then we'll dive right into the conversation. So let's start with Steve Hargadon.
Hi, I'm Steve Hargadon. I'm currently the social learning consultant for Illuminate, the online teaching and learning platform. I started a social network called Classroom 2.0 3 years ago when nobody thought social networking had anything to do with education. And I run an interview series called The Future of Education at futureofeducation.com. And I'm glad to be here.
I'm Michelle Pacansky-Brock, and my background is in community college teaching. And currently, I am an educational consultant for Teaching Without Walls, and I'm also doing contracting for @ONE.
I think you know Ian. I'll just say again that I'm Ian Bogus. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech and the founding partner of a game company called Persuasive Games.
Hi everyone, my name is Regan Carruthers. I currently serve as a consultant to the leadership of the community college system, directing content strategy for them. I spent most of my professional career in the academic publishing industry working for McGraw-Hill as the Director of Business Development. That was my last position in that space. Took some time off from that world, though, to work for a nonprofit called the Institute of Heart Math that is one of the leading providers of research, tools, and technology that help to understand the interrelationship between emotion and cognition and health.
I'm Laurie Burris. I've taught for 16 years at Pasadena City College and was the director of the Digital Media Center. This year and next year I'm taking a leave of absence and working at lynda.com as the Senior Director of Education. And I'm also an author at lynda.com.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Peter Hoffmann. Great to be here. I'm the founder and CEO of a little startup company called Interactive Mobile Solutions. And my background is I've been really in 3 different sectors in my career. I started off at Ohlone College, community college in Fremont, and I was the executive director of the foundation for about 8 years. And then I went to Sacramento, and I was a vice president with the Community College Foundation, and I was the founding director of the Tech Ed conferences that have been around here. So I started those out, and then I was at Apple. I was the National Higher Education Marketing Manager with Apple for 8 years, and now I'm doing a startup. Great to be here.
Thank you. So what we're going to do is we're going to take questions from the audience. So feel free, if you have questions, you can also tweet your questions. We have at least one person listening remotely who's contacted me via Twitter. But if you'd rather raise your hand and ask a question, you can do that. And if you have a question specifically for Ian or anyone else on the panel, you can direct it. Otherwise, you can offer it up to the panel. And my job will be to keep things moving and move us towards 8:30 when we go back out and eat some more dessert. Maybe 8:40 because you guys are a little late getting back in here. By the way, looking up, I wanted to thank the AV guys too. Do a really fine job, and they don't get enough recognition. It's really hard doing what they do. I know people who do it, and it looks easy. You just hook up a few wires and it all works, except when it doesn't, and that's when it's a lot of work and it's a lot of pressure, and we appreciate them. So let me start off. So let me ask the question let me imagine I was a state legislator and I just heard Ian's talk. Okay, so we're looking at the state of education right now. We know students know how to play video games. They know how to play video games, but do they know how to read and write? What is the place of this? Should we really be spending precious time, classroom time, resources, having students engage with games? We know they're doing that already. Aren't there more important things for schools to be thinking about than games in school?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, what I want my legislators to do is to fix primary and secondary education. That's really I think that's the key. And it's not so much about the games as an answer for me. Like, oh, we'll just put video games in, and then the problems are solved. There's another simplistic answer. But rather, what video games tell us about our orientation toward complexity and simplicity in the first place. So, the idea of using games for education is very popular. I've written about it. I've had my hand in it for better and worse as a developer. I think it's a worse idea more frequently than it's a better idea. I think there are good examples. I'll give you one that's accidental. There's this Pokemon. You guys know Pokemon? If you have kids, you know Pokemon. So it turns out that Pokemon demands reading knowledge at a higher grade level than that of the schools for students of an age where they're playing Pokemon. So there's an interesting example of something. But no, absolutely not. Our legislators should not be funding video games in schools. They should be making primary and secondary schools work such that when students graduate high school, they actually have learned something.
I was just going to add, I mean, as a mother of a 7- and 9-year-old who is just so keenly aware of the disconnect and engagement in the learning process in elementary school, the number of times my boys come home and with the piece of paper in front of them, the ditto, the handout, and have to be forced to complete that, and they look at me and say, "But why am I doing this? What am I getting from this?" And see the engagement and the participatory learning that does and can occur within something like a video game. I mean, those are the kinds of things that I think about and wonder why we're not focusing more of our time on shifting our perspective and thinking differently about how to engage students in learning.
I really think we have a crisis of meaning. Can you hear me? Okay. I know when my younger son was 6 and brought his first homework packet home from first grade, it was about this thick. He's doing the work and not having any trouble. And he looks at me and goes, "Mom, why would anyone think that this matters?" And he was 6. I think if you understand neuroscience, we know that emotion matters, and we need to feel loved and cared for and connected to ourselves and each other in order for optimal learning to happen. And when you look at typical classroom management techniques, how disconnected and socially isolated we feel on a college campus as faculty, there is a real disconnection that I think we're often grappling with. And yet we don't necessarily have our learning environments, our pedagogy, our use of mobile devices really honoring and understanding what we need as human beings in order to optimally function. Because I've had this disruptive experience of being thrown in a totally different system that's unlike the college system that I've been in for the last 16 years, I've learned something this year, which is it's time to quit blaming and feeling the shame of the educational process. We can no longer blame government, politics, budgets, teachers, anything. This is a mobile lesson from my daughter today. I texted, "What's wrong? We did not get the room we wanted at all. We are in a suite with a double triple. It may be terrible. I want to cry/die. I am so frustrated by American Studies. I tried really hard on my last paper, and I thought I definitely improved, and I didn't. I'm so sad that nothing I do is ever good anymore. I don't understand what happened." "What grade did you get?" "Last paper I got a B, and this one the TA gave me a B, B minus. I am so done. I just hate everything. There is no point." I write back, "You are too hard on yourself. Ease up. It's all okay." "No, I'm sick of how nothing I do is good enough anymore. I don't know what happened. I used to be smart." What's the problem here? She's checking off a list. She checked off all the classes to get into the right college. This college that she's going to is an Ivy League school. It's Barnard, Columbia. $54,000. I say to you guys, there's only one message I have. Take back the learning. You are the ones who have to take it. You as teachers, we have to start asking ourselves what it is we want to get out of education, and when we define what we want, we have to go out for it. Last spring, I had a class of exceptional students at PCC. We did a flash class, and our number one assignment was we sat down the first week, and we typed in the words of something we'd like to do 3 years from now. They all made a roadmap, and 8 of those 15 students got internships at major companies in Los Angeles because they knew what they wanted. And I just have to say to you, we can sit here and blame governments, but one of the things that I learned from the Al Gore experience was that we all thought he should have been president, but his movie made a difference. And his movie made a difference in my life because I hated taking out trash. But after I saw that movie, I saw the big idea
and I had a reason or a motivation to do something with the trash. So I separate it every day now, and I take it out the right way. And I think what we're not doing for students is giving them the big picture. Every single one of us own our learning path. Every single one of us can make that choice. And if there's any, and I just wanted to make one other thing. If there's any complexity that should be abolished in school, it is the schedule of courses. On Amazon, you can type in 4 keywords and get 4 suggestions of books. On PCC's website, if you don't type in the right word, or you don't know that video is taught in photography and not telecommunications and not fine arts, you cannot find the course. We need to reconsider what we are doing to our students at their very point of entry by giving them a system in which they cannot find what they love, nor what they want to do, nor what they want to focus on, nor what they are motivated to do. What I've learned at lynda.com is that everybody makes their own choices and they create their own learning path and they own it. So I say it again, take back the learning, reward yourself, you're the learner. Sorry.
I was worried that the panel wouldn't have anything to say. So, Steve?
So I'm really curious about what I'm kind of warning is an inherent tension. So for those of us who feel strongly about the taking back the learning, and I think a number of us felt like with Web 2.0 that it created an environment of creation and engagement. And so I look at this device, the Droid that I love, and I sort of feel as though it has 2 paths to it. One of which is it brings me into that world of engagement. But it also, on the cloud side, is accomplishing things for me. And a lot of companies want to do that work for me. So I'm wondering, how do we think about this device as an extension of creation rather than as a simplification of complex tasks that someone else does for us? And is that a tension that I'm feeling alone, or are others feeling the same, kind of wondering, will my children see this device? Will it be used for them in the same ways that Web 2.0 has sort of opened vistas for me?
I read a tweet. I read a tweet this morning. Somebody said, a kindergartner said to her, "What's the smallest city in France?" And she said, "I don't know." And the student said, "Adults don't know anything." And her comment was, "Education mission accomplished." So to follow up on that, let's talk for a minute about, are there any questions from the audience, by the way? I want to, please. So just to summarize the question, the speaker was saying she's working on actually using mobile phones in classrooms where other teachers are talking about how to get the students to turn them off. And so the question is, how can she convince administrators and others that this is a good path and that it's worthwhile and that there's value in students using a mobile device in a class rather than simply being told, turn them off, put them away, we don't want to see them?
I think you have to compare it to a pencil. We wouldn't tell a student not to come to a class to take notes without pencil and paper. And we use Google and the dictionaries and Wikipedia and the communication systems there all the time to do research, to get immediate answers. I use it every day in business. I think it is interesting that education makes rules about learning in that way. And I think if they're looking, what you have to do is change your campus's mind, not seeing it as a social device for gossip like we used to see on the Leave It to Beaver sitcoms, remember that everybody could get on the phone at the same time, but see it as a way to exchange knowledge, and that without access to knowledge, the knowledge that Amazon and Google give us every day for free, it's actually kind of tying their hands behind their back. And we are here not to dish the tools, but to teach them how to use the tools in a superior way that puts them in a place of advantage, in a position where they can make choices and be leaders. And that's, I think, our job as educators is to say, great for lynda.com, great for our art store, great for JJournal. It just makes my job more specific. I am here to facilitate every single student in my classrooms journey to getting what they want and learning what they need to know so they can be superior leaders in whatever it is they want to commit to. And we don't take away tools to do that.
Here's a very pragmatic suggestion. At Georgia Tech, every student, every entering freshman is required to have a laptop. and they can bring them to class. They can do whatever. But one reason, not the only reason, one reason to do this is that it allowed the institution to decommission and otherwise reconfigure the costs and equipment of certain kinds of computer labs, including those in the libraries. So, it's not a very interesting suggestion, but it is a very pragmatic one. There's a way to offload some of this obligation out of the institution, both for equipment purchases and long-term support by, and then you have a Trojan horse, right? So now you've got all these devices, and what are you going to do with them?
So one of the things I've noticed with the emerging technologies in the last 5 years is that it's really hard to convince administrators that they have value if they haven't actually experienced it. So the applications that I've seen, and I'm trying to remember the name of the school that had an Android app that had all the student information systems and the role taking and everything built into the phone. They gave the administrators a concrete application that made a difference for the administrators, so that then they kind of bought in. Oh, okay, so it's really hard to say, hey, we should be letting the students use this, but when they experience it themselves and it has value, I thought that was kind of brilliant.
Just while we're just a comment. I don't know the current state of the California. I guess I know the current state of the California education system, but I don't know the current behavior of the California education system. I haven't been here a long time, but it's very much the opposite where I live. The administration, all the way up, we have one chancellor and one board of regents in Georgia, and they're super on board with this stuff, and a lot of it has being driven from the top down, even in a way that I want to push back on. So just an observation.
Regan, was that?
I was just going to suggest there's strength in numbers, and so recently CSU Stanislaus, I don't know if you've been following the news with the blunder with Sarah Palin coming and all of that. And so one of the professors on that campus who was so dissatisfied with campus policy created a group on Facebook that has grown exponentially so that he can document, the strength of a particular perspective that's not really being honored in the administration's, decisions. So to the degree that you're motivated, try to really create more of a campaign and get, strength by trying to collaborate with, faculty that you may not even know across the campus that have a similar perspective. And then I would suggest that because they really don't want to do things that are totally out of step with what faculty and students really voice. But what we don't tend to do very well is organize our voice or organize our demand. We tend to be so decentralized, we don't know how to do that well. So that would be my suggestion.
Peter, then we have a question from the audience.
Yeah, having spent a little bit of time in the corporate world of the education world, not surprisingly, I think to everyone here, things moves a little faster in the corporate world, and education things, particularly, my experience at the college level, it's pretty hard to make changes, and the culture doesn't really support it. And one of the things that I've become fond of is the idea of just experimentation and pilots, doing little things that are different to see how they work. And large changes are kind of scary, I think. Trying to change a system is really scary, but people don't get as scared about changing maybe an experience in the classroom. And so a suggestion I have is to try to do something that's maybe relatively small and with 20 students or 50 students and see what happens. And if it's successful, that will grow and can be really, really powerful. But without that sort of spirit of experimentation and willingness to try things new, things don't change.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just want to chime in on and highlight, showcase what Peter just said about innovation and the importance of stressing innovation in higher education. And again, something that I think every single one of us has to really think deeply about and start to advocate for in things that you're doing. But I think across the board, innovation is a skill that we desperately need in the 21st century, if you have not noticed. And I think that every single one of us as educators can model innovation in our classrooms, and that, in a sense, translates to our students. But as an early adopter, doing the kind of work that you're doing with texting, and I don't know if you also said Twitter, but part of what you're going to be focusing on, you're going to be doing a lot of volunteer work because you are going to be doing a lot of educating. But what I have found really interesting, and my focus has been online learning, and similar kinds of rub early on. Things are really shifting more so, but there's still a lot of pockets of resistance and not getting it within administration. When you think about what you're doing, you're essentially applying traditional, age-old learning theories about active learning that have been around for decades. You're just doing them through a new format. You're employing social media. And so if you really think about that, you think about things like Chickering and Gamson's 7 Effective Principles of Undergraduate Teaching, and read them. And I think if you can take these new ideas and really understand that you're still employing, these very traditional kinds of excellent concepts of learning theory, it engages people who don't really get it at the beginning, but may have that sense of familiarity from the past. So that's something to think about.
I just wanted to say one. Just to point to Ian's idea about it being economics. I was up at Stanford with Nokia, the cell phone, and we were looking at education, and we had people from South Africa and from Brazil. And I was sitting next to a woman, and she was very engaged. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she says, "Well, I'm the director of education for the whole country of Brazil." And I said, "Well, what did Nokia phone have to do with that?" And she said, "We see the cell phone as a way to solve illiteracy. 85% of the people in Brazil have a cell phone." And the person from South Africa said ditto. So I think if you're not thinking like that, that is the cheapest laptop in many countries. And India and South Africa and Brazil and lots of South American countries are looking at it as the cheapest laptop.
Just a couple of quick responses. Number one, as far as innovation in higher education, I would point out that there's at least 3 people on the panel here who used to work in higher education who are currently not working in higher education. So maybe that tells us something about the acceptance of innovation in higher education, or maybe it's just a good and natural thing that people move back and forth and we shouldn't define our careers by only working in a single sector. Question in the back, please. Okay. So just to quickly summarize, the comment was that maybe we're soft-pedaling the fact that a lot of institutions just don't want to change or have large groups of them that simply don't want to change or can't change. And related to that, I was going to comment that while to you, Michelle, those learning theory ideas are classic, to others, people still haven't accepted them as being valid. So a comment was relating to Marshall McLuhan and his vision and comment that students once came to the classroom because there was more information inside the classroom than outside. Clearly that's not the case anymore. And the idea that perhaps the idea that you come to the classroom for information is an obsolete idea. But also to your comment that Marshall McLuhan is disappearing about textbooks, maybe that tells us something about the value of textbooks. Steve?
So this last week I went to see Seth Godin speak. Okay, So he just wrote a book called Lynchpin, and if you bought 50 copies of the book, you could go see him speak in New York. So I tweeted out that I had 50 copies of the book to give away, sent the receipt, and then I bought a ticket to New York and I listened to him lecture for. Again, we talk. Part of what we're doing here is we're duplicating the very things that we're concerned about in the lecture format. But he did that. But he doesn't. I don't know how much he knows about education, but he said in a sort of a very dramatic way that he expects higher education to implode within 10 years. And his and again, I didn't know how to react to that, but his feeling was that the cost of the education and the accreditation piece are no longer as valuable as they were. And of course, he used kind of the classic examples of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates dropping out of college. But I think one theory would be Clayton Christensen's disruptive technologies theory, that you will have on the fringes educational systems arise that then displace a lot of what we've considered traditional, because the traditional just won't change fast enough. And I would be curious, to sort of, we don't have to do it here, but this is a topic of interest to me. What are we seeing? University of Phoenix, or what are the places where they're potentially going to displace some percentage of what we've considered kind of stable higher ed?
Could anyone here name the largest single campus in the United States according to the U.S. Department of Education? University of Phoenix online, and it's 8 times larger than the second largest campus.
To that point, the top 4 institutions that students now transfer to out of the community colleges in this state, they're going to the for-profits. They're no longer going to the CSUs and the UCs in the kinds of numbers that they were historically. So.
Just to add to that, there's a New York Times, a lot of some other educational magazines have written some articles on that the perceived value of even an Ivy League education is not $54,000, that the actual perceived value of education, what they charge and what people perceive as the value, is not the same. And at lynda.com, we've been doing sort of a survey of what people want in education: authenticity, experience, individual needs addressed, path by choice, transformation, connection, some sort of sensory experience, voice, time, visual, kinesthetic, and again, the choice to create my own path. So these are things that are not embodied at university systems in any way, shape, or form, and these are available on the internet and through mobile devices. So I think and none of those cost a lot of money. So this money thing will come into this again and again in education. This idea that $54,000 gets you the right job in the right place in the United States is going to drop out. It's not true. That's why it's going to implode.
I'll just recommend another thing to take a look at. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but based on the outlines and the interviews I've seen, I think it's going to be very interesting. The book DIYU, have any of you seen that? Do It Yourself University, DIYU by Anna Kamenetz.
And I'm going to just make a plug. So at futureeducation.com, I'm interviewing her this month. Good. So she's highly talked about right now, and it should be a very fun interview.
But that's really the concept of it, that you can build your own university path, and it could be a lot cheaper.
No.
They're all gone, yeah. Okay, question?
Yeah,
we'll
do that.
Put that on the link site, the interview with Anna Kamenetz. Godin. Ben? So the comment was about back-channel conversations. There's a very small but interesting back-channel conversation taking place now in Twitter on this meeting, and but it's interesting how few people actually are choosing to do that. It's actually only just a few people, and that's just a comment, not a value judgment.
I mean, I just make a few observations in response to your observation, maybe none of which are really responses, but just see where this train takes us. I work at a technical institute. One of the benefits of working at a technical institute is that in the DNA of the institution is the idea that stuff changes rapidly, and there has to be a response to it. So there are a lot of pros and cons to a kind of science and engineering, lens on the world. That's one of the pros. As a part of that, one of the things our president has initiated this year is a strategic planning process that's supposed to rebuild the institution 25 years hence. A part of which includes real serious questions like, are we going to have classes? And and I look at the way that we work right now, and it is again, partly because we're a research-oriented technical institute. Things like undergraduate research and the dissemination of the educational experience from the classroom into other kinds of activities has already been going on for some time. So it's it's sort of related. That's one observation that I would make. The other is that once this sort of institutional ramp up takes place, and there's just no choice. My students have they're twittering or they're doing whatever they're doing in my class. I mean, it's fine. It just becomes very quickly becomes a part of the way that you conduct the class. It's not that disruptive, really. I mean, I guess that's the thing I've noticed the most. I suppose we should have more technically oriented students in that sense of adoption and participation. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but if I'm right, then I think that the amount of time it takes to really adapt and adjust for these changes as they take place is relatively minor, as long as you're forced to do it because now everybody's got this stuff and they're doing it in the classroom.
I just want to say we're doing this is an interesting transformation of behavior. We know that we started doing histograms of courses, and our courses are anywhere from like 20 movies to 200 movies, and the movies are 4 to 10 minutes in length. And we noticed that the first hour, hour and a half, they're very, very high usage. Students come in feeling, because they've been trained to think, I have to start at the beginning and go left to right. About an hour and a half in, they realize lunch is almost over, it's 12 midnight, kids have gone to bed, I'm too tired, and they start doing what we call jumping to topics, key topics, as they realize there's absolutely no reason why they can't take a movie or a chapter in any order that they wish, but it takes an hour and a half before they learn that. Which is interesting. The other thing that happens is lynda.com is very similar to YouTube. We tell you what the most viewed are and what the most popular are, but other than that, currently on the site, we don't really tell you how to navigate the site other than saying this is new this month. And there are a number of courses that do phenomenally well by viral marketing alone, of which no one at lynda.com has any influence over. So our actual members are telling other members and putting it on their blogs and in their Twitter feeds and things like that. So they're the counselors. And it's an odd phenomena, and we understand we're not making much power of that, but that's very strong, that people are teaching each other how to learn. So those are two phenomena that we see frequently.
So the question was, are there good models of sort of standard patterns that you might use for using mobile technologies in the classroom?
I can give one example of something that I've done when I was teaching at the community college level the history of women in art. I would get students of all sorts, right? The students who are really passionate about the subject, the students who are in the class because it was the only one that had any seats left. Students are in the class because it's the right time of day. And so starting that class very critically about this topic was very important, and I didn't want to just stand up there and say, history hasn't remembered many women artists, but there were many of them. I wanted them to actively come to that conclusion on their own, right? And so something that I had them do was take out cell phones and make phone calls to people. I gave them 5 minutes, and I said, you can call as many people as you want, but we're going to basically survey people, and have them list 5 artists. Have them just list 5 artists and write those artists down. And so we did that. They just kind of started going out and making calls, and then we kind of brainstormed those names and put them all up on the board, and then took a step back and, how many women are up there versus men? And how many women artists were repeated over and over and over and over and over, Georgia O'Keeffe, So it was that kind of bringing in voices from outside the classroom. I mean, think about globalization and how much we're not using global learning in our students' learning context. I mean, that in itself, and when I had my students do that, they looked at me like, oh, I can use my phone? And it was a great way to start the class. So it's one specific example.
My son is attending Princeton, and they have to do a junior paper and a senior paper. And for his junior paper, we would, in my day and age, being over 50, you would have made a proposal and you would have given it to your head teacher, and they would have said yes or no. In order to do his proposal for his junior paper, he had to go out on the internet and to a number of sources to prove that position for that paper had not already been taken, and that his position was a new and refreshed point of view. Now, this is a different way of teaching using the internet, where we actually use the accessibility to information to challenge the way our students develop their own ideas. Not to say just go use it as a brain dump and you can get all these facts, but to go find out. And he came back to me and he said, oh my God, Mom, somebody's written about humor in Japan in 1940s. That's exactly what I said. I said, well, what was their position? And he said, well, and he had to re-switch his position and go back to his committee and change the paper because he found something too close to his own position. The second thing that I wanted to bring up that's really good with the internet is that I think a lot of learning could use some chops from what musicians know about playing a piano or playing an instrument. There is still the need for mastery, and it certainly is necessary in the fine arts. Mastery is that experience. You cannot any way take one course and say that's equal to 200 hours of drawing that David Hockney did over 6 months. So mastery is something we need to re-emphasize in education, and one thing that's great about online learning or video learning or on the internet is that you can do something again and again and make mistakes in privacy and do it completely anonymously. And we need to give that back to our students, that repeating things, making mistakes, falling down, coming down the slope, being afraid of the diamond hills is okay, but to give them the privacy to learn and to go after mastery. This is a very big concept that's being completely lost in education right now, mastery. And that's where education, traditional education, has chops, and they should use it.
I want to say just one thing about the impact of having a room full of people with mobile devices on which they can look up information. It goes back to the comment about information inside and outside the classroom. And this is probably one of the reasons why not all faculty members, to say the least, are comfortable with the idea. Simply put, the faculty is no longer the lone authority in the room. The information is out there, and the faculty member or the instructor or whoever or another student in the class makes a statement. Someone can very quickly look up and challenge it and say, well, that's not what it says on Wikipedia. And then you can have a discussion about why does it say that, what is the value of that word, how is it sourced, what do other sources say, what is the quality of that information. That's much more interesting than a lecture on information literacy and how to evaluate sources. So I think that's a paradigm that a lot of us have seen in recent years in our professional lives, and people giving lectures and being challenged in a way that I always thought that higher education valued critical thinking and challenging ideas and using evidence. But that doesn't mean that everyone who works in higher education is comfortable when they're on the hot seat for that. Steve?
So I love that question. And as I heard the answers here, I started thinking, well, how do I use my phone as a learning device? And interestingly enough, probably the #1 use of my phone as a learning device is for time shifting. So I have podcast feeds for NPR's hourly top news. So I can listen to the news whenever it's convenient for me. And I download TED videos, and I can watch them when I want to watch them. And my guess is that some of what we're talking about isn't actually classroom, but it's the producing of material that's available on the device for later consumption for the student who, like me, somehow learns better when I'm listening than when I'm reading, so that I can listen to a lecture a couple of times. So maybe some of that's taking place outside of the classroom.
That's a great point. Peter?
Yeah, one of the questions, I think, one of the things we've been talking about is about how competitive is education and higher education, how we're doing. And we're looking at this conference at mobility. I'm wondering what percentage of your students, let's just say, look at 50%, and how many of if you're in a classroom, how much would you say that more than 50% of your students have a smartphone? Raise your hand. A smartphone of some kind. That has browser capabilities. Raise your hand high, over 50%. Okay, let's say over 25%. So let me give you some interesting statistics. Some of these are from Mary Meeker, who's a Morgan Stanley analyst, who's had done some really interesting reports. But she said that basically we're in the fifth sort of major technology trend in the last 50 years. And I think this will ring true to you. In the 60s, it was the mainframe. The 70s, the mini computer. The 80s, it was personal computing. The 90s, desktop internet computing. And we're now in the age of the mobile internet. And in this age of mobile internet computing, over the next 5 years, what she's saying is that people will be using the mobile internet more than the desktop internet, which is staggering. And what does that mean, in terms of the competitiveness of education? If that's what, and think about who's using smartphones. I mean, I don't know. Show you my daughter or my 13-year-old daughter. She's on it all the time texting. I don't know, 200-300 texts a day or whatever it is. But kids are way ahead of adults in terms of the use of smartphones. So they're the ones that are in the educational system. We know what's happening with the mobile internet. So I mean, if it's not here now, it's going to be here soon. So the question is, in what ways are our educational systems adapting to the sort of the possibility that mobile technology will allow, both the software and the hardware, because it's coming at us. And kids are digital. They love digital devices. So if we're not taking advantage of it, you get that situation that what they love to do and what they're really good at, they're going to be leaving that outside of the classroom, and that seems like a real shame.
Regan?
I don't know if you feel this way, but as I'm listening to a lot of this, there's another layer of tension. When I was working at the CSU system for the leadership there for the last 5 years before I switched to another system, 60% of the incoming students into the CSU system cannot place into freshman composition or college algebra. And so I think one of the challenges is, yes, it's true that students have this installed base of technology and they're very facile in social media, but they can't do algebra, and they're having difficulty reading for comprehension. Skills which we know, regardless of our uncertain future, are necessary because it informs how we perceive and interact in the world. And so I think the challenge to all of us is to look at the reality of what we're doing and make sure that we don't get too infatuated or too romanticized by some of this, and make sure that we are taking this installed base of technology and putting the resources, mostly our hearts and our minds, into using it in a way that really is going to serve students, because we're doing a lousy job to date.
I want to take this in a slightly different direction for a minute here and go back to something that Steve touched on when he showed off his droid. And that has to, I want to talk about technology for a minute. We've definitely made this a meeting that's not just about technology, it's more about learning than about technology. But I want to ask you a question about the technology for a minute, and that has to do with technology as a tool of creation versus technology as a tool of consumption. I was very struck, we've all been struck by the enthusiasm around the iPad, and it's a fascinating and very interesting piece of technology. It's also something that by design is not really designed primarily to encourage creation of media. I mean, it doesn't have a camera on it. It's actually hard to, not particularly easy to type. It uses a system where one corporation decides what you can put on it and what you can't. That's not to say it's not a fantastic and fascinating piece of technology. It doesn't have a revolutionary interface in some ways, or at least it's revolutionary in the sense of putting some great interface ideas in front of a larger public that haven't been there before. But without getting into Apple versus Google or anything like that, what is the impact of technology on how we think about creativity and creation of media and art and objects of various kinds versus the technology as a tool for purchase, consumption, and simply going to the App Store and buying what you want? I'd be really interested in comments by the panel on that general. Again, not as an Apple versus anyone kind of thing, but just the general concept of where we're going.
Yeah, this is a huge issue. I mean, there's many ways to attack it. I'll just make some observations again without conclusion. So let's remind ourselves that when you bought a microcomputer, a personal computer, an Apple II or a Commodore 64 or something in the early 1980s, you booted it up, you blink, the cursor would blink at you.
Ready.
And then what you could do a lot of things. You could load programs. You could also start programming in BASIC immediately. And everyone was essentially a programmer of their computer. Recently, I dug up a bunch of old Apple II ads from 1977, and if you look at the rhetoric that Apple was using at that time about how you really want a computer where you can write your own software so that you can do the custom things that you want, is so different from what we see today. My students, this is Georgia Tech, right? I mean, they don't know what a command prompt is. I have them do stuff. These are computing students, and I'm not talking about like just any student. So that unfamiliarity or that historical moment is gone. And one of the interesting things that I've been doing is I teach these classes, so I can do this, and the class is very easy. Looking at the history of computing as a way of understanding this issue. Not so much that we're going to solve it or that there's an answer that's easy, but rather, hey, this is where we've been, and here's how it led to where we are, and here's where we're going, and you're going to have to figure out what to do about that. We tend not to look at technology as having a history at all, especially computing systems. It's just like full speed ahead. What's next? What's next? What's next? And part of the solution involves stopping, backing up, and looking at the history of computation in the same way that we look at the history of anything.
Steve and then Laurie.
Okay.
Well, so there's a saying that the cure to the ills of democracy is more democracy. So what's kind of intriguing to me about Web 2.0 is that, or participative media, or whatever you want to call it, is that it's raising very interesting questions, some of which I think get answered by passionate educators choosing to steer that technology in a direction that they know is helpful. So again, the instance of it was so interesting to me that I didn't think of podcasts immediately when you asked that question about what apps. But that's an act of creation. It's very easy to do, and it can be taught by educators. And with devices like this, it can become even more powerful. So maybe it's just, in part, educators who are very concerned about that kind of education, saying, okay, I really want to make a difference. And because of Web 2.0, I actually can. I can start a blog about using technology devices in pedagogically sound ways.
I guess I wanted to address the creativity part, because one of the things that I see with the internet and mobile devices is actually new ways of communicating, and actually I think spawning new art forms or creative forms. One of them that's simple is when Seth Godin wrote his book, he published it as a real book, he published it as a PDF, and then he published the responses of the people to the book as a book of stories about his book and how it had affected their lives. So there was this transformative capture of that. My own son on Facebook said he was really sick of Facebook and thought it was shallow and really not about friendships. It was about how many people you friended. So for the last 100 days, he's been every day he's been posting a famous line from the top famous 100 lines in AFI Top 100 Movies. And so the day he posted Martini Shaken Not Stirred, people said, God, Willie, did you get drunk at the eating party? I mean, in other words, nobody knew that the posts that he was doing were not his own lines, that they were from famous movie. And every day there's this whole set of reactions to these lines that are not his own lines. And then the last story is he and a friend, my son is into improv comedy, and he went to a rural part of Japan, and the first thing he did was get into an internet cafe, which are prevalent, and he said to me, I'm not funny here because nobody understands English. And I said, well, you've got an iPhone. And so he started taking pictures and posting them and then putting two different titles under them, one in Japanese and one in English. And the English ones were hysterical, as well as were the Japanese one, because he doesn't know Japanese very well. So he had a Japanese following, and he had this American following, and pretty soon this Japanese journal of a sophomore in Japan was being sent all over the Facebook and the high school that he'd attended and everywhere, and was seen like by 1,000 people by the end of summer. And nobody knew who Willie was, but it was this crazy two different points of view photojournal. So I think I just wanted to address that. I think there are some really interesting ways that I'm seeing students who do nothing but photography with their iPhone. I think we really are just beginning to see a surge of ways to share, explore different points of view, storytelling, and things like that.
Or she. The comment was the more the technology is dispersed and the more people get their hands on it, the more creativity there will be.
I just wanted to say, because it's a really important concept, one of the things that scares people in internet companies, which I wouldn't have known, is free. There are so many people willing to do free things, give free information, share open source. Free is one of the biggest competitors to any internet business. So it's amazing that free is out there.
We'll come hear Regan's talk tomorrow. It's related to that. Michelle, did you have a comment?
I just have to chime in on the Leonardo da Vinci thing, because my discipline is art history, and I adore Leonardo da Vinci for a lot of reasons, and it's mostly not because of his painting or his drawing, but he journaled constantly, right? Most people know that. And what I think when I think about blogging, it's this idea of democracy, and I think about how many minds out there are blogging right now, and we have access to that, and we can learn from that. I mean, that's the way I look at it. And I think about, as all of these stories are being told out there, we're really gonna start to be thinking critically about, well, what stories are being told in the mainstream, and why aren't these? I mean, so this idea of storytelling through blogging, and it's really, I think, a very fascinating thing to think about how it's gonna move us.
I think that's a great place to stop. This is an endless conversation. Please continue the conversation at dessert afterwards. There's more food. Continue the conversation tomorrow and continue the conversation on the Ning site. Thank you all very much.